Out on a gray sea state, a ship rolls steadily while deck crew check lashings and secure cargo gear. In the crew station, radios hiss under low light and route boards glow beside the console. The command room stays busy but quiet, with hands pointing at a map and keeping the next handoff synchronized. The frame stays with the motion of supply itself, pallets sliding forward, straps tightened, paperwork handed across a console, a small but constant effort to keep the system moving. The most important battlefield here is not a trench line. It is the route, the port, the fuel line, and the last mile of supply. Occupied Crimea is already showing the ordinary signs of strain. Reuters images showed visible fuel queues and gasoline shortages in the peninsula. That is a simple image, but it carries weight. When drivers wait longer for fuel, the peninsula is not just having a bad day at the pump, it is revealing friction in the system that keeps vehicles moving, keeps public life moving, and keeps the wider support network from losing tempo. A queue is not yet a collapse. It is a warning that the margin is shrinking and that supply pressure has moved from the map into daily life. A follow-up Reuters report said gasoline shortages persisted in Crimea even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. That phrasing matters. It suggests a problem that is being managed, not solved. It also suggests that the pressure is not isolated to one station or one town. A persistent shortage spreads behavior changes. People plan around it. Transport schedules adapt to it. Every part of the system begins to spend time and attention simply trying to stay level. The problem is not dramatic on one screen, but it compounds across the ordinary decisions that keep a region running. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense says enemy logistics on routes to Crimea were brought under fire control. That is the deeper layer of the opening picture. The peninsula is not only feeling pressure at the fuel counter, it is feeling pressure on the routes that feed it. When a route comes under fire control, the effect is more than a headline about distance or geography. It is uncertainty. It is delay. It is the need to think twice about every movement, every transfer, every shipment that depends on a corridor staying open and predictable. That uncertainty reaches the planner, the driver, and the depot manager at the same time. The same logic is visible in ordinary logistics work. A ship rolls in a low sea state. Deck crew check lashings and secure cargo gear. A crane moves equipment, and a command room keeps the next handoff synchronized. Pallets move forward, straps are tightened, paperwork changes hands, and the system depends on thousands of small actions that have to happen in the right order. A deckhand bends to check a line, a hatch is closed, and the sea keeps rolling outside. That pressure is not confined to Crimea. Reuters reported that Ukraine struck Mariupol port and significantly limited its use. A port does not have to be erased to matter. If its use is restricted, the effect spreads outward through the logistics chain. Fewer options remain, turnaround slows. The remaining links have to carry more weight. For any supply network, especially one running under wartime pressure, that kind of limitation is as important as physical damage. It forces adaptation, and adaptation costs time. When one port becomes harder to use, the rest of the chain has to work around it. AP reported that Ukrainian strikes set off fires at oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea. That widens the picture from transport to storage and processing. Fuel pressure is no longer only about what can move across roads, rails, and ports. It is also about what can be refined, stored, and held in reserve once it gets there. When a fuel system starts to absorb repeated shocks at different points, the stress becomes cumulative. The impact is not a single break. It is a series of small losses of flexibility. This is how strain travels in wartime, from one node to the next, until the whole system feels less forgiving. In the same reporting cycle, AP and ISW linked the Cheboksary strike narrative to VNII progress and to Russia's military production ecosystem, while other reporting pointed to strikes and fires in the Samara region. Those details do not form a neat single event. They form a pattern of rear area pressure. The pattern matters because it shifts the burden inward. Instead of only worrying about the front line, Russia has to manage the factories, depots, fuel nodes, and industrial spaces that sustain the fight. Rear area pressure is not a side issue. It is where capacity, timing, and resilience are tested. That wider pressure sits inside a larger European frame. After the Tallinn summit, Ukraine's president described Nordic-Baltic cooperation as part of support for Ukraine and European security. NATO's Allied Air Command said Ramstein Flag 2026 opened with more than 200 Allied aircraft across Europe. Reuters also reported that a French NATO jet shot down a drone in Latvian airspace. The Baltic side of the map is not separate from the war. It is part of the same security picture, where airspace, alliance posture, and support logistics all interact. The alliance picture matters because it shapes the environment in which the strike campaign is being absorbed. Reporting also said Germany pledged €300 million to the Czech ammunition initiative for Ukraine. That matters not because it solves the problem in one move, but because it shows the support system still pushing resources forward. On one side of the story are fuel queues, port pressure, fires, and route disruption. On the other side are Allied aircraft, alliance coordination, and ammunition support. The balance is not static, it keeps moving, and every move shapes the next one. So the cold open is simple. Crimea is becoming a supply problem. The queues at the pump show the civilian face of that problem. The routes under fire control show the military face. The strike on Mariupol port shows the maritime face. Fires at oil facilities show the energy face. And the wider Baltic and European context shows that none of this stays neatly inside one peninsula. It is a logistics campaign with a regional footprint. It is the kind of strain that does not need a dramatic explosion to be felt. It appears first as a cue, then as a delay, then as a decision to wait, reroute, or do without. The briefing begins where wars often become most visible, not at the point of impact, but at the point where movement slows and the system has to admit it is under strain. In the command room, the picture stays busy with one simple task: keep the movement going, or find another way to move it. Nothing in the scene has to be dramatic for the pressure to be real. A calm deck, a steady watch, and a set of routes under strain can tell the whole story. That is the opening frame. The fight around Crimea is not only about impact, it is about the ordinary systems that make a peninsula function: fuel, access, traffic, port use, and the narrow channels that let supplies arrive and continue on. When those channels tighten, the problem becomes visible before it becomes decisive. People see it in line lengths, in waiting time, in the sense that the next delivery is no longer guaranteed to arrive with the same ease. In occupied Crimea, Reuters' visual reporting showed fuel queues and gasoline shortages. The lines were visible, not theoretical. A later Reuters report said the shortages persisted even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. That wording matters. It shows a supply problem that is already being felt in public view, where movement depends on what can be bought, delivered, and kept flowing. The queue is not only a sign of scarcity. It is a sign that normal circulation has slowed enough for everyone to notice. That does not mean every vehicle stops at once. It means the routes themselves are being forced into a harder condition, where movement has to be planned under pressure, and every delay becomes more expensive. For a logistics network, that is the difference between a smooth current and a channel full of hazards. A route that once felt routine now has to be treated as contested space, and contested space changes behavior long before it changes maps. On the deck, that idea is easy to understand. If cargo is lashed down properly, if equipment is checked, if the sea state is rough, the crew slows and adapts. Nothing sensational has to happen for strain to appear. The same is true in logistics. A system can keep moving for a time, but once the safest route is no longer the easiest route, every part of the chain has to work harder. More checks, more rerouting, more waiting, more uncertainty. The work goes on, but it goes on with friction. Reuters also reported that Ukraine struck Mariupol port and significantly limited its use. That matters because ports are not just points on a map. They are pressure valves for freight, fuel, and movement. When a port's use is reduced, the impact does not stay at the waterfront. It spreads outward into schedules, inventories, and the confidence of those who depend on regular arrivals. A port does not need to be erased to become harder to rely on. It only needs to become less dependable. And once that happens, the surrounding system starts to reorganize around the risk. AP reported Ukrainian strikes that set off fires at oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea. That is another layer of the same pressure. Fuel is not only something people buy at the pump, it is also the condition that keeps transport, movement, and rear area activity functioning. When oil facilities burn, even briefly, the message is broader than the smoke itself. It says the system behind the system is under strain too. Storage, processing, distribution, and the expectation that tomorrow's supply will look like today's supply all come under pressure at once. That pressure is practical, but it is also psychological, because every fire forces another round of reassessment. Viewed from a bridge or a command room, the pattern is cumulative. Fuel queues in occupied Crimea. Shortages that persist. Routes brought under fire control. A port whose use is significantly limited. Fires at oil facilities. Each element by itself would be a problem. Together, they create a logistics picture that is harder to smooth over with assurances. That is why the struggle is not only tactical, it is managerial, industrial, and psychological. The fight is over whether movement can remain normal. Once normal movement is uncertain, every other decision becomes more complicated. The footage that fits this story is not flashy. It is the practical work, a ship in a gray sea state, deck crew checking lashings, hands-on equipment, a crew station lit by dim panels and moving data, radios alive with low static, a command room where the watch never really ends. The frame is calm, but the job is not. Everything depends on whether the next thing arrives on time and in usable shape. That is the same logic that governs the routes toward Crimea. If the chain stays open, pressure can be absorbed. If the chain tightens, every link starts to show the strain. There is also a wider context that reaches beyond the peninsula. In Tallinn, the Ukrainian president's office described cooperation with Nordic and Baltic countries as part of support for Ukraine and European security. NATO's Allied Air Command said Ramstein Flag 2026 began with more than 200 Allied aircraft across Europe, and reporting said Germany pledged €300 million to the Czech ammunition initiative for Ukraine. Taken together, that is not just diplomatic language. It is a reminder that the contest around Crimea sits inside a much larger security environment, one where airspace, ammunition, and alliance coordination all remain active. That wider layer matters because logistics does not exist in isolation. The same region that is watching fuel shortages and port pressure is also watching Allied air activity, drone incidents, and continuing support for Ukraine. The effect is cumulative. Russia has to stabilize supplies while managing pressure on routes and rear area infrastructure. Ukraine and its partners are working within a broader pattern of support and pressure, each part reinforcing the others without needing to announce itself loudly. In that sense, the peninsula is only the visible edge of a deeper contest over endurance. From a naval perspective, the lesson is old. Control the movement, and you shape the battle before it ever reaches a decisive point. Make the route uncertain, and the whole chain slows. Make the port less useful, and the map changes around it. Make fuel harder to count on, and every vehicle, every transfer, every schedule becomes less certain. That is how a peninsula becomes a problem of access rather than a simple place on the map. The ships still move, the crew still works, the radios still hiss in the station, but the system around them has to spend more effort just to preserve the same result. So the story of Crimea in this phase is not only about attack and response, it is about friction. It is about the quiet work of making movement more difficult until the system itself has to admit strain. On the water, on the deck, in the crew station, in the command room, the same principle applies. A force can endure many things, but it cannot ignore logistics forever. Eventually, the route itself becomes the battlefield. At the logistics board, the first problem is not the explosion, it is the route afterward. A hand traces corridors across a map while equipment status lights blink in a calm, practiced rhythm. Nothing in that scene is dramatic. That is the point. Logistics is usually not dramatic until it fails. And when it fails, the failure is felt first in places that seem far from the strike itself. The fuel queue, the port gate, the loading bay, the storage tank, the last truck in line. In occupied Crimea, those signs are already visible. Reuters footage showed drivers wading through gasoline shortages in Russian-controlled Crimea, and follow-up reporting said the shortages persisted, even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. A fuel shortage is not only a consumer inconvenience. In a contested theater, it is a sign that the normal rhythm of movement has been disrupted. A system built on steady delivery begins to show strain at the curb, at the pump, and then farther back, where every delayed shipment has to be rerouted, replaced, or rationed. That is why the route picture matters. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense said enemy logistics in Luhansk Oblast and on routes to Crimea were brought under fire control. The phrase is important because it speaks to pressure on movement itself, not just on a single warehouse or one isolated road. It means the route becomes harder to trust. The timing becomes harder to predict. The cargo becomes harder to protect. Once that happens, even a well-stocked rear area starts to behave like a place under stress. The peninsula does not have to be isolated in the geographic sense for it to become isolated in the operational sense. It only has to be harder, slower, and less certain to supply. That pressure also reaches the ports. Ports matter because they are not just concrete and cranes. They are handoff points where sea, rail, and road meet. When a port is constrained, the effect is broader than the blast radius. Cargo stays put. Schedules slip. A vessel waits longer at anchor, or a truck waits longer at the gate. In a naval briefing, that is the kind of detail that matters. A port that cannot move goods efficiently stops being a node and starts becoming a bottleneck. That is also why the visual evidence is so telling. A ship at sea, a deck crew member tightening a line, a console in the crew station, a command room screen, a crane at port, a fuel line stretching past a station canopy. None of those images is spectacular on its own. Together, they show a system in motion. Logistics is often invisible when it works. It becomes legible when it slows. And once it slows in one place, the delay pushes outward into the next link. AP reported that Ukrainian strikes set off fires at oil facilities in Russia and in Crimea. ISW's assessment places those attacks inside a wider operational pattern, one that is changing the picture of the war well beyond the immediate strike site. Fuel does not move only because a refinery exists. It moves because production, storage, transport, and security all line up at once. When any one of those layers is disturbed, the rest have to absorb the shock. Fires at oil facilities do not need to be described in sensational terms to understand their meaning. They are pressure on the system that keeps vehicles moving, machinery running, and supply chains alive. The same reporting cycle also pointed to strikes and fires in the Samara region, and another thread connected a Cheboksary strike narrative to Russia's military production ecosystem. The details differ, but the pattern does not. The rear is no longer a silent backdrop. It is part of the contested map. In that setting, a shortage in Crimea is not just a local inconvenience. It is part of a larger effort to make the southern logistics network less dependable, less efficient, and less certain from one end to the other. That is why the fuel pressure in Crimea should not be read in isolation. It sits inside a broader campaign that is touching ports, oil facilities, and the transportation corridors that connect them. The result is cumulative. Each strike does not have to do everything. It only has to add another delay, another reroute, another reason for a queue to grow longer. Over time, those delays begin to matter as much as any single hit. In a logistics war, the damage is often measured in the time it takes to move the next load. At the same time, the wider security picture continues to tighten around the Black Sea and the Baltic region. After the Tallinn summit, the Ukrainian president's office described Nordic and Baltic cooperation as part of support for Ukraine and European security. Reuters also reported that a French NATO jet shot down a drone in Latvian airspace, another reminder that the pressure is not confined to one front line. Germany's pledge of €300 million to the Czech ammunition initiative adds another layer to the support arc. None of that fills a fuel tank in Crimea by itself. But it shows the scale of attention now surrounding the battle over logistics and airspace. Back on the ship, the deck crew keep working through the gray sea state. They check the equipment, speak in short calls, and keep the cargo secure. In the crew station, the screens remain steady. In the command room, the route board still matters more than the slogan on the wall. That is the lesson of this episode. Occupied Crimea is not only under pressure because of a headline strike or a single shortage. It is under pressure because the routes feeding it are being contested. The port access around it is being constrained, and the fuel system behind it is being forced to prove it can still function. In war at sea, the map is never just a map. It is a ledger of distance, delay, and risk. And when fuel becomes scarce, the coastline begins to speak in a different language. Along the Azov coast, the map is not just a map. It is a working picture of pressure points, a ledger of distance, delay, and risk. One of those pressure points runs through Mariupol and back into the rear area that feeds Crimea. That is why a port story and a fuel story belong together. The port of Mariupol matters, because ports are not only places where cargo arrives, they are places where timing is absorbed, redirected, or broken. That is a simple phrase, but the meaning is larger than the words. When a port loses flexibility, every convoy, every transfer, and every downstream schedule becomes harder to protect. The harbor no longer behaves like a smooth node in a supply chain. It becomes a contested space, watched, slowed, and complicated. On deck, the camera catches a sailor crouched beside a secured pallet, gloved hands checking a strap and then moving to the next fitting. A crane arm sits still against the sky. Stowed equipment lines the rail. Nothing about the scene is dramatic in itself, and that is the point. Logistics is usually made of small, ordinary acts repeated under stress. A line is tightened, a latch is verified, a compartment is sealed, a route is marked and remade. In wartime, these are the details that decide whether a system keeps moving. The Russian-controlled coast opposite Crimea has been under pressure from more than one direction. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense said enemy logistics in Luhansk Oblast and en routes to Crimea were brought under fire control. That is an official statement, and it should be treated as such. It does not tell us every detail of the battlefield. It does tell us something important about the shape of the campaign. The routes themselves are becoming the target. Not only the vehicles, not only the storage sites, but the lines of movement that link rear areas to the peninsula. Fuel is one of the clearest signs that a logistics problem has become visible to the public. Reuters reported visible gasoline shortages in Russian-controlled Crimea, with drivers grappling with long queues. A separate Reuters follow-up said gasoline shortages persisted even as Russia vowed to stabilize supplies. The significance is practical, not theatrical. Fuel shortages do not need to be total to matter. They create waiting, rationing, detours, and uncertainty. They force local systems to spend time and attention on continuity instead of movement, and that delay compounds. Every stop becomes another cost, and every cost makes the next delivery harder. In the command room, a hand moves across a lit chart table. A second screen shows a different angle. Route lines, ports, staging areas, and the spaces between them. The crew was not looking for a single decisive blow. They are watching for pressure that accumulates. A port that is less usable. A fuel market that is harder to stabilize. A road or rail corridor that cannot be treated as safe by default. In war at sea, the map is never only about the coastline. It is about what the coastline enables, and what happens when that enabling function is interrupted. That matters because fuel systems are not isolated. A shortage at the pump can reflect strain far upstream. Storage, refining, transport, and local distribution are part of the same chain. If one layer is stressed, the others feel it. ISW's reporting on the campaign points to the same broader picture. Rear area pressure is reshaping the operational environment. The exact damage at each site is often less important than the persistent message sent by the strikes. The rear is no longer assumed to be quiet. The crew station remains calm. A radio crackles, then settles. One sailor traces a line on a route board and checks it against a second marker. The visual language is deliberate: movement, confirmation, correction. That is how logistics is managed even in peacetime. In war, the same routine becomes a form of defense. A route that once looked ordinary now needs escort, timing, alternate planning, or simply more risk accepted at the far end. A port that once handled cargo as a matter of course now becomes a question of exposure. This is why Mariupol and Crimea belong in the same story. They are separate points on the map, but they sit inside the same pressure system. Mariupol is a port problem. Crimea is a fuel problem. The routes between them are a movement problem, and the rear areas behind them are an endurance problem. Together they show a campaign aimed at making Russian logistics less predictable, less efficient, and less resilient. On the flight line and in the wider European frame, the support environment is also shifting. The Ukrainian president's office described Nordic-Baltic cooperation after the Tallinn summit as part of support for Ukraine and European security. NATO's Allied Air Command said Ramstein Flag 2026 began with more than 200 Allied aircraft across Europe. These are not the same as the strikes on ports and fuel systems, but they belong to the same strategic atmosphere. Airspace, alliance coordination, and regional security are all tightening as the war tests the edges of Europe's defense picture. In that context, Germany's pledge of €300 million to the Czech Ammunition Initiative for Ukraine fits the same support arc. It is reporting, not a battlefield claim, but it shows how the wider coalition is still trying to sustain the pressure. Aid and air power do not replace logistics pressure. They complement it. One sustains the front, the other constrains the rear. Back on the ship, the sea state remains steady. The deck crew finish one check and move to the next. No one hurries. The work is methodical because method of endurance. A secured load stays secure. A marked route stays usable. A markered compartment stays within limits. That ordinary discipline is what gives shape to a campaign that otherwise looks abstract from a distance. The lesson from Mariupol, the Azov coast, and rear area supply is not that one strike ends a war. It is that war at this level is often won and lost through repeated friction, a port that cannot be used as freely, a fuel market that cannot be stabilized quickly, a route that must be watched instead of assumed. A rear area that now has to account for pressure where it once expected routine. When those conditions build together, the whole system slows, and that is the larger picture here. Ukraine's strike campaign is turning occupied Crimea and Russia's southern logistics into a route, fuel, and port problem. It reaches across the peninsula and into the industrial rear. It does not need dramatic language to be effective. It only needs persistence. In the logbook, that kind of pressure looks quiet. On the map, it looks like distance. In reality, it looks like delay, spreading through every layer of supply until the rear can no longer behave like a safe place. By the time the factory layer comes into view, the logistics picture has already changed. Nothing has to look dramatic in the moment. The motion is measured, the work is routine, and equipment is handled the way it always is. But that is the point. The pressure in this war is often invisible until it becomes impossible to ignore. In occupied Crimea, the signs are visible. Reuters reporting showed drivers waiting in fuel queues, and gasoline shortages remained in place even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. That is not a battlefield image. It is a supply image. It is the kind of image that tells you the rear is no longer behaving like a rear. It tells you that the systems that make daily movement feel ordinary are starting to slip out of reach. Once that happens, every part of the route matters. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense said enemy logistics on the routes to Crimea were brought under fire control. That phrase matters because it describes pressure on movement itself. Not just on one truck, one depot, or one road, but on the lanes, links, and timing that make a peninsula feel connected to the rest of the system. The more those routes are watched, threatened, or disrupted, the harder it becomes to keep the whole chain calm. The sea picture matters too. Mariupol is part of the larger logistics map, and port pressure does not stay local. When a port becomes harder to use, the effect spreads into scheduling, cargo handling, redistribution, and repair. A ship may still move. A crew may still work. But the confidence that normally comes with steady harbor access begins to fade. The result is not a single collapsed route. It is a narrowing of choices. That same pressure reaches the fuel system. AP reported strikes that set off fires at oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea. Fuel is not just a commodity in a war like this. It is the common denominator behind transport, generators, staging, maintenance, and movement. When fuel sites burn, the problem is not only the immediate loss, it is the delay that follows, the detour, the rerouting, the uncertainty about what can still be counted on tomorrow. A logistics system can absorb one problem. It struggles when the problems begin to layer. That is where the factory layer comes into view. AP and the Institute for the Study of War both tied the Cheboksary strike narrative to VNIE, our progress, and to Russia's military production ecosystem. The reports do not ask you to imagine a single decisive blow. They point to a larger industrial network that supports the war in pieces and parts. Factories do not need to be all destroyed to matter. If the production ecosystem is forced to absorb repeated shocks, then output, repair, and replacement all become harder to keep at the same pace. The same reporting cycle also included fires in the Samara region. Again, the significance is not just the location, it is the pattern. Rear area pressure is spreading across fuel systems, industrial sites, and transport corridors. That creates a war of attrition against the things that make the war durable. The front can still look active. Drones can still lock. But the deeper the pressure goes, the more the entire machine has to run hot just to keep from slowing down. From the bridge of a ship, that kind of pressure is hard to see all at once. You see the deck crew working the gear. You see equipment moved, checked, and stowed. You see the calm repetition of hands-on lines, hands-on radios, hands-on paperwork. You hear the low conversation in the crew station and the steady rhythm of the watch. The war appears as motion, but not as chaos. That is how logistics usually looks before it fails. It looks orderly, right up until the order becomes too expensive to maintain. And beyond the Black Sea and the occupied peninsula, the wider air picture keeps shifting too. Reuters reported that a French NATO jet shot down a drone in Latvian airspace. That is a different theater, but it belongs to the same strategic environment. The drone war does not stay neatly boxed in. It spills outward, touches Allied airspace, and forces NATO to keep attention on the edge of the map while the ground war keeps grinding in the south and east. For the man visible, after the Tallinn summit, the Ukrainian president's office described Nordic-Baltic cooperation as part of support for Ukraine and European security. Those are not abstract diplomatic details. They are evidence that the surrounding security architecture is still active, still organizing itself, and still trying to carry the line around a war that keeps pushing outward in different forms. Germany's pledge of €300 million to the Czech ammunition initiative for Ukraine fits into that same picture. It is reporting, not a battlefield result. But it tells you something important about the support network on the other side of the map. Ukraine is being backed not only with statements but with industrial and military capacity from partners who understand that the war is being fought in shells, air defense, logistics, and production as much as in headlines. That is why this episode is really about the factory layer behind the drone war. It is about what happens when routes to Crimea come under pressure, when fuel queues become visible, when ports lose utility, when oil sites burn, and when industrial reporting points to the military production ecosystem itself. The campaign is not just forcing movement into the open. It is forcing the system to reveal how fragile its rear has become. In the end, the map is changing in plain sight. Occupied Crimea is no longer just a rear base. It is becoming a route problem, a fuel problem, and a port problem. And those problems reach across the peninsula into Russia's industrial rear, where factories, depots, and transport links all have to keep working under pressure. That is the quiet truth behind the visible scene on the water. The war is not only striking the front, it is working through the layers that keep the front alive. By this point, the question is not whether the story is dramatic enough. It is whether the system can keep moving under pressure. Transport links, timing, and coordination all have to carry if the whole chain is going to function. The pressure on occupied Crimea is not only a matter of strikes, it is logistics, and logistics is where endurance shows up first. Read against that backdrop, the fuel story in occupied Crimea is hard to miss. Reuters showed drivers and fuel queues, and follow-up reporting said gasoline shortages persisted even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. A queue at the pump is plain evidence that the chain behind it is strained. That is why the queues matter even when they are only static footage. They show a supply chain under strain, not a single broken moment. Fuel is the medium through which movement becomes possible. When it becomes scarce, the effects spread outward into daily life, transport planning, and the ability to keep pressure on every other part of the system. For a peninsula dependent on steady flow, shortages are not a side issue. They are the issue. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense added another layer when it said enemy logistics in Luhansk Oblast and on routes to Crimea were brought under fire control. That is the official wording, and it matters because it points to pressure on the routes themselves, not just on the endpoints. In practice, the lines of movement that feed the peninsula are being made more difficult, more uncertain, and more expensive to use. You do not need a dramatic collapse to change behavior. You only need enough pressure that every convoy, every dispatch, every transfer has to run a little slower and a little less confidently. On a ship, you can feel what that kind of pressure does. A small delay at one point changes the rhythm of everything that follows. The same logic applies at Mariupol. A port does not have to vanish from the map to stop behaving like a reliable port. If cranes, berths, and traffic management are interrupted enough, the harbor becomes a choke point instead of a release valve. That is why port pressure matters here. It is not only about what is hit, it is about what stops being easy. When the maritime routes tighten, the whole rear area has to adapt. Cargo has to be shifted, schedules changed, and any system already under stress has less room to absorb the shock. On a map, that looks like one harbor. On a logistics board, it changes the routing logic for everyone downstream. Mariupol is part of the same map of strain as Crimea. AP reporting then placed fires at oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea inside the same wider campaign. Oil facilities are part of the machinery that turns crude into movement. When they burn, the impact is not limited to one tank or one fence line. It can reach transport, storage, maintenance, and the confidence that supply will arrive on time. In a naval briefing, that kind of rear area pressure matters because it changes how much freedom the opponent has to move fuel and materiel under cover of distance. AP and ISW also placed parts of the reporting cycle in the Samara region, fitting the same rear area pressure pattern. The point is not to inflate damage. The point is to recognize the direction of the campaign toward fuel systems, industrial rear areas, and the infrastructure that keeps military movement alive. This part of the briefing needs discipline. Claims move quickly in a war like this. New labels spread quickly, and every side wants the most dramatic version first. But the job is to separate what can be verified from what is still noise. On that standard, the verified picture is already strong enough. Occupied Crimea is showing visible fuel queues. Gasoline shortages have persisted. Routes to Crimea are under official Ukrainian fire control claim. Mariupol port has been significantly limited in use. Oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea have burned. That is a real operational pattern, even before anyone adds a more colorful label to it. The Baltic frame matters because this is not isolated. Reuters reported that a French jet on NATO mission shot down a drone in Latvian airspace. The Ukrainian president's office framed the Tallinn summit as part of Nordic-Baltic cooperation that supports Ukraine and European security. Germany also pledged €300 million to the Czech ammunition initiative for Ukraine. Taken together, those are not just diplomatic gestures. They are the same sustained response arc: airspace, ammunition, coordination, and regional support all moving at once. It is the wider envelope that makes the peninsula story harder to isolate or ignore. Back on the ship, none of that looks dramatic in the moment. Deck crew still check lashings, sailors still read the route board, radios still crackle in the crew station under low light. The command room still has to make the transport picture carries together. That ordinary work is the right visual language for this episode, because the story is not a single explosion or a single headline. It is the tightening of a system. It is the slow conversion of occupied Crimea into a place where routes, fuel, and ports all require more caution and more effort. The war is not only pushing at the front, it is working through the layers that keep the front supplied, and that is what the verified evidence shows. Taken together, the pattern is clear. A logistics campaign reaches across the peninsula, into Russia's rear, and outward into the Allied security frame around the Baltic. The supply lines are under pressure, and the pressure is now visible enough to read. The uncertainty is now the point. A hand rests on the rail, a glance moves from the chart table to the horizon, and the whole scene stays calm, methodical, and ordinary. Nothing here needs a combat flourish. It is seamanship, logistics, and attention to detail, the kind of quiet work that makes a larger briefing feel grounded. That is the right lens here, because the story is not one sudden blow. It is a series of pressures moving through fuel, routes, ports, and the rear areas that feed them. The most visible sign comes from occupied Crimea itself. Reporting showed drivers waiting in gasoline queues, and follow-up reporting said gasoline shortages persisted even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. That matters because shortages are not just a headline. They are a daily sign that the system underneath the peninsula is under strain. On deck, when the weather shifts, crew feel it first in the way they move around the rail and the station. On land, the same principle applies to fuel. When supply is tight, the pressure shows up where people wait, where vehicles line up, and where normal movement begins to slow. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense says logistics on routes to Crimea were brought under fire control. That wording points to pressure on movement rather than a single isolated incident. It suggests routes that have to remain open if fuel, supplies, and military traffic are going to keep flowing. Read together, those reports point to a logistics chain under strain from more than one direction. On a ship, the lesson is familiar. A passage only works when the lanes stay open, the timing stays clean, and the equipment arrives where it is supposed to arrive. When those lanes narrow, the whole schedule tightens. The pressure is not confined to the shoreline. AP reported Ukrainian strikes setting off fires at oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea. That broadens the picture from route pressure to fuel system pressure. In the same reporting cycle, other reporting linked a strike narrative in Cheboksary to VNIR progress and to Russia's military production ecosystem, while separate accounts described fires in the Samara region as part of the same rear area strain. Those links should be treated carefully. The open record does not always show the exact material effect of each event, and not every smoke plume becomes a strategic change at once. What it does show is direction, pressure on the assets that keep vehicles moving, machinery supplied, and production supported. This is where the episode stays disciplined. We know Crimea is already showing visible fuel queues and gasoline shortages. We know those shortages were reported as persisting. We know Ukraine says it has brought logistics on routes to Crimea under fire control. We know Mariupol port was struck and reported as significantly limited in use. We know oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea were hit. What we do not know from the source record is the exact cumulative damage, the precise duration of each disruption, or the full downstream effect on every depot, tanker, and workshop. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the boundary between what can be stated and what still has to be watched. The wider security frame helps explain why the open record reads this way. In Tallinn, the Ukrainian president's office described Nordic-Baltic cooperation as part of support for Ukraine and European security. None of that proves a direct link to the Crimea campaign. It does show the broader environment, Allied air power, Baltic vigilance, and a region where the security picture is active from sea to sky. The Baltics are not a distant backdrop here. They are part of the same security weather, moving from summit statements to air patrols and ammunition pledges. Reporting also said Germany pledged €300 million to the Czech ammunition initiative for Ukraine, adding another layer of material support to the same strategic frame. That matters because logistics campaigns do not happen in isolation. They unfold in a theater where supply, air cover, and industrial support all influence what can be sustained. On the ship, the deck crew keep working regardless of the weather. A line is checked, a fitting is tightened, a crew station is watched, and the motion of the sea is absorbed without drama. The same kind of discipline is visible in the reports here. Pressures applied, routes are watched, fuel becomes harder to move, ports lose flexibility, and the rear area begins to feel closer than it should. The map does not need a burst of noise to show that change. It only needs the steady accumulation of friction. So what do we know, and what is still unclear? We know occupied Crimea is showing fuel queues. We know gasoline shortages persisted there, even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. We know Ukraine says it has put routes to Crimea under fire control. We know Mariupol port has been reported as significantly limited in use. We know fires have been reported at oil facilities in Russia and occupied Crimea, and that other reporting in the same cycle points to pressure reaching into industrial rear areas as well. What remains unclear is how quickly repairs, rerouting, or supply adjustments can change the picture, and which part of the network will give way next. For now, the sea stays gray, the deck stays busy, and the radios keep hissing. The supply lines are still under pressure, and in the open record, that pressure is visible enough to read. Farther north, the same kind of watch continues in a different form. A watchstander leans over a console. Another hand marks the movement on a chart. Nothing here has to look dramatic. In this kind of briefing, the important movement is measured. The plots keep updating, and the pressure on the map keeps spreading. For months now, occupied Crimea has been giving that pressure a visible shape. Reuters reporting showed fuel queues in the peninsula, and a later update said gasoline shortages persisted, even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. The images matter because they do not speak in abstractions. They show vehicles waiting, drivers idling, and a fuel system that is no longer behaving like a stable rear area. When shortages begin to show up at the pump, the problem is no longer hidden inside a staff map or a statement from a ministry. It is in the open. It is visible to anyone who can read a line of cars. That phrase matters because it describes not a single strike, but pressure on the movement that keeps the peninsula supplied. Routes that once looked routine become uncertain. Timetables become less reliable. Every tanker, truck, and convoy has to move under a heavier burden of risk. The result is not only a shortage of fuel, it is a logistics problem in the widest sense. A route problem, a timing problem, and a confidence problem. That pressure is not confined to one road or one depot. Mariupol sits in the broader Azov logistics picture. And when a port is limited, the effect ripples outward. Cargo that would have moved through one node must be shifted, delayed, or rerouted. On the deck, that kind of disruption would be easy to understand. A crane stops. A line goes slack. A pallet sits where it should have been gone an hour earlier. On a war map, the same thing becomes a question of throughput. The movement slows. The system strains. The margin shrinks. The pressure also reaches into the fuel system itself. AP reported that Ukrainian strikes set off fires at oil facilities in Russia and in occupied Crimea. That does not need embellishment. Oil facilities are part of the rear that keeps the front supplied, and when they burn, the consequences are felt beyond the fence line. The reporting cycle around those strikes also pointed to the Cheboksary narrative and to VNIR progress, tying the story to Russia's military production ecosystem, while separate reporting connected related fires and strikes in the Samara region. The full damage picture is not always clear in the open record, and it does not need to be overclaimed to make the larger point. The rear areas are being pressed from more than one direction. That matters because the war is not only about the line of contact, it is about the system behind it. Fuel, ports, industrial sites, ammunition supply, transport corridors, repair capacity, and the confidence that each piece will still be there tomorrow. When those components are stressed together, the effect is cumulative. A shortage in Crimea is not just a shortage in Crimea. A port limitation in Mariupol is not just a port limitation. A fire at an oil facility is not just a fire. Each one pulls on the same fabric. Each one makes the next movement harder. On this ship, the crew do not need a lecture to understand how that works. They know what it means to wait on fuel, to guard equipment, to keep a station manned when the environment is changing faster than the schedule. They know how a steady sea can still carry risk beneath the surface. A shift in wind, a late message, a missed window. The whole system can begin to tighten without much warning. That is why the camera lingers on simple things: a hand on a rail, a chart on a screen, a crew member checking gear, a watch supervisor looking up from a console. Those are not decorative details. They are the language of readiness. Now the same pressure is appearing farther north and west, in the Baltic space around Latvia and Tallinn. The Ukrainian president's office described Nordic-Baltic cooperation after the Tallinn summit as part of support for Ukraine and European security. In practical terms, that means the political and military conversation is widening, not narrowing. The Baltic states are not separate from the war's effects. They are one of the places where those effects are being watched, managed, and answered. Reuters reported that a French jet on a NATO mission shot down a drone in Latvian airspace. That is the Baltic spillover in a single incident. It does not mean the war has crossed into a new phase by itself, but it does show how quickly the security picture can reach beyond Ukraine's borders. Airspace has become part of the same watch pattern as the sea lanes and the fuel routes. The margins are narrower. The response times are shorter. The alliance has to stay alert in more than one direction at once. NATO's Allied Air Command says Ramstein Flag 2026 began with more than 200 Allied aircraft across Europe. That scale matters. It means the region is not being managed with symbolism alone. It is being covered by mass, by training, by coordination, and by the visible presence of Allied air power. Operationally, that is the overhead picture. A lot of moving parts, all trying to stay synchronized while the pressure continues on the eastern edge. The support arc is also visible in material terms. Reporting said Germany pledged €300 million to the Czech ammunition initiative for Ukraine. Again, the number is not the story by itself. The story is the continued effort to keep the supply side moving. Ammunition, air power, logistics, and political cooperation all sit on the same map now. One summit in Tallinn, one incident in Latvian airspace, one air exercise across Europe, and one funding pledge to the Czech initiative all speak to the same thing. The Baltic Rim is not watching the war from a distance. It is being drawn into the effort to shape it. Back on the ship, the sea state stays gray. The deck stays active. The crew keep their stations. Equipment remains tied down and checked. In the command room, the watch continues to track the motion on the plot and the movement in the wider theater. What began as fuel queues in occupied Crimea has grown into a broader pattern of pressure on routes, ports, oil facilities, and rear area industry, with the effects now reaching into the Baltic air and the Allied response around Latvia and Tallinn. The map is larger than the peninsula now, but the logic is the same. Wherever a supply line can be strained, it is being watched. Wherever a rear area can be disturbed, it is being tested. And wherever the pressure shows itself, the record keeps it visible. For the closing assessment, the lens stays on motion. A watchstander studies the displays without hurry. In the command room, screens glow against a muted interior. Equipment is secured, lines are tidy, and every motion feels measured. Nothing about the scene is dramatic, and that is part of the point. In a logistics war, pressure rarely announces itself all at once. It appears in small delays, longer queues, altered routes, and the steady need to keep the system moving. That is the better lens for what is happening around Crimea. Reuters imagery showed visible fuel queues in Russian-controlled Crimea, where drivers were already dealing with gasoline shortages. Follow-up reporting said those shortages persisted even as Russia said it would stabilize supplies. That is not just a consumer inconvenience, it is evidence that the rear system itself is under strain. Fuel has to arrive, be distributed, and be available where it is needed. When that chain becomes unreliable, the effects spread outward. A queue at a station is only the most visible part of the problem. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense has said enemy logistics in Luhansk Oblast and en routes to Crimea were brought under fire control. That official statement matters because it frames the campaign not as a single dramatic event, but as pressure on movement. A route under pressure is a route that must be watched, rerouted, guarded, repaired, or worked around. Each of those responses costs time and attention. Each adds friction. And friction is the currency of logistics warfare. The goal is not always immediate destruction. Often it is to force the other side to spend more effort moving the same amount of material. The same pattern shows up in Mariupol. Reuters reported that Ukraine struck the port and significantly limited its use. Ports are not just points on a map. They are transfer nodes, where cargo becomes throughput and throughput becomes operational reach. When a port becomes harder to use, the effect is not limited to the pier itself. It reaches into scheduling, storage, handling, and the wider chain that depends on predictable flow. A port that works less efficiently is a port that changes the tempo of the entire rear area. In a campaign built around logistics pressure, that matters. Then there is the fuel system beyond Crimea. AP reported Ukrainian strikes setting off fires at oil facilities in Russia and in occupied Crimea. That is another layer of the same campaign. Fuel is not only something that has to be shipped. It has to be stored, processed, moved, and protected. When oil facilities are hit and fires break out, the rear no longer feels like a safe place separated from the front. It becomes part of the battlefield in a different form. The concern is not only the visible blaze, it is the downstream effect on supply, repair, and confidence. AP and ISW reporting also linked to the Cheboksary strike narrative to VNIIR progress and to Russia's military production ecosystem. The reporting did not turn that into a simple one-line answer, and it should not be simplified here either. The point is broader than one building or one factory name. It is about the network that supports production, integration, and replacement. In the same reporting cycle, strikes and fires were also tied to the Samara region. That broadens the picture again. The pressure is not confined to one coast, one route, or one depot. It is reaching into the rear areas that keep the campaign supplied and the war machine functioning. From a naval perspective, that is what makes this episode less about spectacle and more about endurance. On deck, the ship stays steady. The sea state is gray and routine. A sailor checks equipment and secures the area around the station. Another watches the weather and the movement of the ship with the habit of someone who knows that small details matter. That same logic is visible in the campaign ashore. A fuel queue, a compromised route, a port under constraint, a fire at an oil facility, or a disruption in a production ecosystem are all separate facts. Taken together, they describe a system under sustained pressure. The wider European context also matters. The Ukrainian president's office said Nordic-Baltic cooperation after the Tallinn summit is part of support for Ukraine and for European security. None of that is the same story as a queue for gasoline in Crimea, but it is part of the same strategic frame. The war is not happening in isolation. Support, posture, and airspace incidents all shape the environment around it. They show that the consequences of the fighting and the response to it are felt well beyond the immediate front. Germany's pledge of 300 million euros to the Czech ammunition initiative for Ukraine fits that wider support arc as well. Ammunition, like fuel, is part of the invisible architecture of war. It is not the kind of detail that makes a headline in the way a strike or a fire does, but it is the kind of detail that decides whether a force can keep operating. The broader lesson is simple. Sustained support to Ukraine is being organized on multiple fronts, while Russia's logistics and rear areas are being made more difficult to rely on. Those two pressures move together. So the closing picture is not a single strike, and it is not one port, one road, or one fire. It is a campaign designed to stress the system from the outside and the inside at once. Wherever supply can be interrupted, the effort is to interrupt it. Wherever fuel can be delayed, the effort is to make delay costly. Wherever a port can be constrained, the effort is to reduce its value. Wherever the rear area can be made less stable, the effort is to make every movement more expensive. Back on the ship, the command room remains calm. The deck stays damp. The sea continues its measured motion. The crew keep to their stations, and the equipment remains secured. Nothing in the scene needs to shout. The record already says enough. This is a logistics war, not a single strike story. It is a campaign of pressure across routes, ports, fuel systems, industrial rear areas, and allied responses. And the more those pieces are watched together, the clearer the pattern becomes. Ukraine is not only striking targets, it is forcing the system behind them to work harder, move slower, and carry more strain.